In a world where justice is supposed to be blind, there are those who believe the scales are tipped in favor of the powerful. The ones who are meant to protect us are often the ones who cause the most harm. The police force, sworn to serve and protect, have become a symbol of fear and mistrust for many. And the court system, designed to ensure justice for all, has failed time and time again. But there are those who refuse to be silenced, who fight for change, and who demand accountability. Join our host, former Texas police officer and major crimes detective, Justin Carlson, on a journey through the darkness as he shines a light from his extensive 14 years of experience on police injustice and the failed court system. And as he speaks with the many others who have also experienced injustice. This is Failing Justice.
Good evening, Failing Justice audience. I am Justin Carlson, your host, as always. Welcome to the Failing Justice podcast. I want to welcome each and every one of you. Happy Wednesday. It is Wednesday, but not live tonight. This is just a recording you guys are going to be able to listen to at a later time. Just me tonight, solo in the studio, which I haven't been here by myself in a while, so it's kind of different. It's real different. I did it for a long time by myself, but it has been probably close to 2 months since I've been in here by myself, so a bit different, but nonetheless, I'm super happy to be here. Man, it's been a busy couple of, I'll tell you what, it's been a busy couple of weeks. We took a break for Thanksgiving. We had a show last week, and it's just been real crazy. But tonight's show, I want to gear towards. I want to highlight another wrongful conviction, but before I do that, I want to segue into that by starting with my trip to New York City. So last Thursday, I flew to New York City for the UJC Summit, which is the United Justice Coalition Summit. And it was at the Javits Center in Manhattan. They're on the Midtown on the west side. And never been to that. Never been to a summit like that. Of course, it was just the second one. I know I've been aware of who the United Justice Coalition is, which, if you don't know what that is, it's just a group for criminal justice reform and social reform and stuff like that. And I kind of talked about it a little bit last week, but I tell you what, it was real. I go back to if somebody would have told me, 3 years ago even, that, hey, you're going to be flying to New York City to meet with a bunch of people about criminal justice reform, I would have just told you you're crazy, because that's just not something that, being in law enforcement, again, when you heard criminal justice reform, you just immediately thought, oh, well, that's just a bunch of people that are trying to get away with fixing the system so they can get away with crime. And that's just sadly the truth of what I was always taught, being ingrained in the law enforcement culture. And but real quick, I'll tell you what. I just want to play this this recap video real quick, and then I want to talk a little bit about the trip itself. So, I love, at the end of that video, there's a sign. I was sitting in the in the main entrance to the Javits Center, which was huge, and there was that sign there. It said, "We love that if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere." And it was just kind of, that's the old Empire State of Mind by Jay-Z. If I can make it here, you can make it anywhere. And also with Frank Sinatra. And I just saw that, and I looked up, and here I am in big old New York City with thousands and thousands of people that I don't know. I'm in a place that I'm not familiar with. I'm about to embark on a day that I've never embarked on before with people that are all about criminal justice reform. And I looked up, and that sign was there, and I just thought to myself, I was like, that would be one of the first signs. I know it sounds kind of cliche, I guess, but that was just kind of one of the first signs. I was like, I am in the right place. I made it to New York, and if I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. And it just kind of reaffirmed, like, hey, you're on the right path. You're doing the right thing. And man, it was just so overwhelming. Like I said, I was just in a place where, I thought to myself, I was like, and I'm writing a blog on this to put on the website for Failing Justice, but I was like, it's kind of crazy that I felt like I was probably one of the only police officers that was in the building, aside from like the security and stuff like that. Now, I mean, I don't know that for sure, but I'll tell you one thing: there was not a lot of police officers that I did see there. I know there were some people from the Attorney General's office, the New York State Attorney General's office, that were there, stuff like that. But anyway, I just was like, man, I'm the only police officer here, and how are these people going to take me being here? Because I tell you what, it was so amazing to sit down and be a part of listening to the other side. Being in law enforcement for so long, you only hear one thing. You hear the law enforcement side of things, and you don't really pay a lot of attention to everything else, just because that's you're taught to focus on one side of the coin, and there is a flip side. Since I've started my journey on failing justice, I just realized that there is another side to things, and I was with people that had been impacted negatively, wrongly, by the criminal justice system, and on a larger scale. You attend all these conferences with law enforcement, and good conferences. I'm not knocking the conferences. Crimes Against Children conference, I've been a part of that, where we all gather for the betterment of fighting crimes against children, and but I've been a part of so many law enforcement conferences, and to be a part of this was just so different. But it was in an amazing way. And just to hear how one of the first panel discussions that came up, it was called Family Matters. And all that was a group, I think it was 5 or 6 people. They were family members of people that had been impacted negatively by the criminal justice system. So whether that meant they were wrongly convicted, couple of those family members sitting up there had lost their family members that had been killed by the police. And to hear those stories was just like, and those were just a few. We're talking 4 or 5 people out of, thousands and thousands of people who had gone through that. And I just thought to myself, like, What if law enforcement just took the time to sit down and hear these people out? Act like we care about them, because I feel like so many times, like in law enforcement, we work a case, and you know, we're so focused on getting finding the bad guy. We're so focused on trying to get an arrest, and then we send it to the prosecution side, and it's so focused on trying to get an indictment and then trying to get a conviction that we just don't take the time to sit down with these people after the fact, or even during. I know, I mean, there were some real tears on that stage from some family members. There was a dad sitting up there who had lost his son, was killed by a police officer in New York. I looked the case up. I did a lot of research on the case. Not going to talk about it here tonight, but the police officer, in short, his son, college kid, was sitting in front of a venue, a location, and one police officer asked him to move. So his son moved his car, and there was another police officer up ahead, and that police officer perceived him moving his vehicle as aggressive, and he jumped up on the hood of the car and he shot through the window, and he killed this boy. His name's DJ Henry Jr. And you know, there's a lot of things out there on that case, but I mean, that dad, he was there and he was telling that story, and it just, like, you know, they lost their son, and that police officer went on and he lived his life. That agency carried on every day. They continued operating, and it's like, if somebody could just sit down and hear their side, hear the things, how they feel, how they were impacted. You know, I just don't feel like law enforcement does that. I don't feel like we sit down and we talk to these people and we give them a chance to give their side of the story. And just sitting there hearing those things, it was really impactful for me. It was an eye-opener. I'd already, you know, the past couple months, I've already been really just diving deep into wrongful convictions and things like that, and just being able to be there for those people. And I don't think, I mean, I was insignificant there. There was a lot of people there. I was just a face in the crowd, but just being able to be there, it made my heart feel warm. I felt good about it, and I felt like I was doing the right thing. And so it was just really cool. I mean, I'd never been a part of anything like that, and I was really glad that I ended up going and being a part of that. But one thing I want to play a video here in just a second. This is crazy. I think I'll just play the video, and then I will explain to you how I came across this, and then we'll dive into it just a little bit and talk about it. Tonight's podcast won't be very long, but I do want to talk about this. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video, and we'll do some recap on it.
Tonight, a story of doggedness and perseverance, a hunt for the truth and the meaning of justice that have carried an imprisoned man and an NBC News journalist on an unlikely 2-decade-long journey in search of answers. The Sing Sing Correctional Facility houses more than 1,400 prisoners. Each can tell you why they are here.
Dear Mr. Slepian, I spent a lot of time trying.
Some will tell you why they shouldn't be.
I know I don't belong here, but I am a firm believer that everything that happens to us in life is for a purpose.
It was a single letter addressed to Dateline NBC producer Dan Slepian, sent by Jon-Adrian JJ Velasquez, who was serving a life sentence for the murder of a retired police officer, convicted solely on eyewitness testimony.
And I get a lot of letters, as you know, from people who claim to be innocent. But what was so different about JJ's letter is it was meticulous. It was focused.
Dozens more would follow. Skeptical but curious, Dan paid JJ a visit.
The 12 jurors said you're here for a reason. You should be locked up because you committed murder.
That's what they gathered, but they didn't know the whole story, and neither did I at that time.
And there began a 20-year journey. JJ's unbending claim of innocence, Dan's search for the truth, detailed now in the new NBC Studios podcast, Letters from Sing Sing.
What I've learned over the past 2 decades haunts me.
Dan, tell me what Letters from Sing Sing is about.
It's about how and why someone can be wrongfully convicted, but more importantly, you need a bolt of lightning to strike the courthouse door to even get another day in court. That's really what this is about.
JJ gave Dan mountains of case documents and challenged him to prove him guilty.
I knew that he would unveil something that would look odd to him or something that actually proved that I'm innocent. But the thing that he wasn't going to find was any evidence of guilt.
So did you accept the challenge that, okay, I'm gonna show you're guilty?
He challenged me to prove his guilt, and I accepted the challenge.
Dan tracked down the key eyewitness. He told Dan he was pressured by police and basically picked out JJ at random after looking at more than 1,800 mugshots.
I don't know if I really picked out the right person.
20-plus years in, Dan is still unearthing bombshells, recently interviewing a juror in the case.
In my heart of hearts, I knew he was innocent.
She walked into the room and started crying.
The jury had been sequestered for 3 days, and she told Dan she only voted guilty because of peer pressure.
What you're essentially saying to me is that JJ was convicted not necessarily because of the facts or the evidence, but because the jury was tired and wanted to go home. Is that true?
I'd have to say yes. I think that's the truth, yes.
So why is that critical right now?
When people listen to this podcast, they're going to hear a mountain of evidence that that jury never heard that points only one way to his innocence.
Every time Dan gives me a call with new information, I'm impacted the same way. It feels like a stab in the gut sometimes. Had they made a different decision, my life could have been a lot different.
His sentence was commuted in 2021. JJ was released from prison, but is still fighting to clear his name.
I was sentenced to 25 years to life for the crime that I didn't commit. And now I'm being sentenced to an additional term in society.
At a White House forum last fall, JJ got something he didn't expect. You got an apology from the President of the United States.
On behalf of all society, I apologize.
It meant a lot to me because it meant recognition.
Recognition that began with a single letter and a journalist willing to listen.
I am not an advocate for JJ. I am an advocate for truth.
Tonight, a spokesperson for the Manhattan DA's office tells us its post-conviction justice unit is conducting a reinvestigation of JJ Velasquez.
Okay, so let me tell you guys something. Downstairs at the Javits Center, they had an exhibit hall, I guess if that's what you want to call it, and so they had a lot of booths set up for a lot of nonprofits, like the Innocence Project was there, Hudson Link for higher education, which is for education for people in prison. Just a lot of different places that were fighting for criminal justice reform, and it's kind of overwhelming. There were so many booths down there, but I was walking around and I'm just walking up to the individual booths, and I walked up to the booth. It was the Frederick Douglass Project, and there's a lot of people around. And I walked up to a gentleman, and he said his name was John, and he was a younger guy. I say younger, I mean probably somewhere between 25, 30, and I handed him my card. I said, "Hey man," I said, I don't want to." He asked me what I did, and I said, "I don't want to scare you, but here's my card." I said, "I'm a cop out of Texas." And man, when you say I'm a cop in a place like that, I didn't know what kind of response I was going to get. Be honest with you, I was just, I told him, I said, "Hear me out." I said, I'm here. I said, I flew here from Texas on my own to be here because I want to be a part of some change. And I said, you know, that's why I'm here. I said, I'm battling the culture of law enforcement from within. I said I'm trying to change and let people know, like, hey, I'm a police officer. I've been a police officer for 15 years, and I see a problem with the system. And if I see a problem with the system, I know other people do. Obviously, look at we're all gathered here. And I gave him my card, and he kind of smiled and laughed a little bit. And he said, "Well," he said, "I'll tell you what, I'm not. You didn't scare me off." He said, "I think it's actually really cool what you're doing. I think it's amazing that you're here from Texas." And so he said, "I want to introduce you to somebody." He said, "I want to introduce you to my dad." So another gentleman came over, bald-headed gentleman, sharp dressed. I noticed that immediately. I always notice when somebody's dressed nice. And he said, "This is my dad, Jon-Adrian Velasquez." He said, I'm a junior. This is senior." I said, "Oh, nice to meet you." He said, "Nice to meet you too, man." And so his son, John Jr., said, "Hey, man, this guy's a cop out of Texas, and he flew here to be a part of this and to be a part of the change." And he's like, he had that real heavy New York accent, you know. He's like, "Oh, no kidding." And I was like, "Nah, man." I said, "Here I am." And I kind of talked with him for a little bit. He said, "Well, listen, man." He said, I was wrongfully convicted. He said, "I'm actually still on parole right now." He said, "I'm still fighting for my exoneration." He said, "But it should be any day." I said, "Really?" I said, I've really recently got into, the wrongful convictions and the stats behind it. I never really realized how many people were actually wrongfully convicted." I said, they don't teach cops that. They don't really teach us how to avoid those things. I said, so I've been really interested in that, and, I'd like to hear your story. He said, "Well, I'll tell you," he said, "I wouldn't be here right now if it weren't for this man over here." And he pointed at another gentleman. And I recognized this man. I was like, "Who is this?" I know he looks so familiar. Like, I've seen him. I know I've seen him. I said, "Who is that?" He said, "That's Dan Slepian from NBC Dateline." I was like, "No way, man. Like, that's Dan Slepian?" He said, "Yeah." He said, I literally would not be standing in front of you today if it wasn't for this man." So he called Dan Slepian over. He said, "Hey, Dan, come here." So Dan came over and introduced himself, and John, JJ, John Sr., we're going to call him JJ. I think that's his nickname. JJ said, "Man, this guy's a cop out of Texas. Same story. He flew here to be a part of the change." He's like, "I think that's super cool, and I want to introduce you to him." And Dan just kind of, he put his arms out, and he said, "Come here, man, give me a hug." And he grabbed me, and he pulled me in, and he said, "Man," he's like, "Are you really here out of Texas, and you're a cop, and you came here?" I said, "Yeah, man." I said, "I took off work." I said, "I purchased a hotel, purchased the plane tickets." I said, "I'm here." And he said, "That is absolutely amazing." And we kind of talked for a few minutes. I want to show you a picture that I took with these guys. So that's Dan Slepian with NBC Dateline on the left, and then that is Jon-Adrian Velasquez, JJ. They're on the right. And those are the two guys that you just saw in the video that I just played. So I kind of want to run this story down on the podcast tonight. Just real briefly, I had reached out to JJ. I got JJ's contact information, and I got Dan's contact information. And JJ couldn't be on tonight. I was going to remote him in. He's in New York. He's an hour ahead of me. But he couldn't be on tonight. Eventually, I do want to get him on, just in case I don't say something correctly. I don't want to say anything incorrectly. But this case just blew my mind. But yeah, there you see Dan and JJ. They're wonderful guys. I tell you, man, just like two of the nicest people that you would like. When you think of New York, you've always heard, oh, a bunch of rude people. And I mean, they were just so kind to me and took me in and made me feel completely comfortable in a place where, I'm going to be quite honest with you, I was a bit uneasy. Just kind of like I shared at the beginning of the podcast, because I just wasn't sure. But man, some of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. But so that was just a quick video. That was a 4-minute segment, a 4-minute piece from an hour segment that aired in not too long ago. So there's an entire podcast, and I'm going to put the link to that podcast in the show notes. So if you're listening to this after the show, scroll down to the show notes and make sure you check that link out. It's 8 episodes, and I promise you, if you like crazy stories with turns and twists that have to do with crime, this is the podcast to listen to. It's called Letters from Sing Sing. So Sing Sing State Penitentiary is where JJ was locked up for 23 and a half years of his life. And so just real quick to run this story down, and I'm not, you have to listen to that podcast to get the details. This is just a quick recap, and I promise you I'm not even covering a sliver of it, because if you listen to the story, you're just going to be sitting there in utter disbelief at how the system treated this man. One of the kindest people I've ever met. But so back in 1998, in January, actually, there was a retired NYPD cop. He was running an illegal gambling den out of his place in Harlem, New York. And 2 people came in. One person was a gunman. The other person was a kind of his accomplice. He had some duct tape. He was like taping people up. Well, the gunman ended up getting in an argument with the retired NYPD cop, and some shots were fired, and the NYPD cop was shot in the head, and he was killed. And so what kind of the description from people right off the bat, from some of the witnesses that were there, they said, hey, it was a light-skinned black male with braids. That was the actual shooter. So they ended up finding some of the witnesses just a little bit later, and I want to make sure, again, just in case I get something wrong. I don't want to get it wrong, but that's why I'm just going to do this real quick. But they found some of the witnesses, and they brought them into the station, and they wanted to try to figure out who the shooter was, because the shooter got away. So the accomplice was Derry Daniels, and Derry Daniels was brought in, and then I think it was like a couple of days later, like 2 days later, one of the witnesses, by the name of Augustus Brown, they ended up finding out that he was there. He was a witness to the shooting. So they found Augustus Brown, and they brought him into the station. Well, Augustus Brown had like 10 bags of heroin on him. And so they laid those 10 bags of heroin down on the table and interviewed him and said, hey, listen, you need to tell us who the shooter was. We know that you probably know. So they were pressuring him using that heroin. So he was there for several hours. And, of course, I mean, I get it. A retired cop was killed. And so they're going to want to figure out who was behind this. And so I get it. But there's some practices, some deceptive practices that as law enforcement, you shouldn't use. And, I've been a major crimes detective before, and there's been plenty of cases that I want to solve. But you have to be cautious with how you do it. So they brought this guy in, and they're using this heroin against him, saying, we need you to identify this guy. So, like, after about approximately 1,800 photos that they had this guy looking at, he ends up picking out Jon-Adrian Velasquez, JJ. Picks him out at random. Says, hey, this is the guy. And they release Augustus Brown with his heroin, by the way. Hey, take off. You're free to go. Thanks for this identification. After looking at more than 1,800 photos. 2-3 days later. So now they have what they think is their prime suspect. Now, bear in mind that they also had another suspect by the name of Mustafa. I can't remember his last name, but Mustafa was somebody that they were looking at. Now, keep that in mind. So now they're looking after to find Jon-Adrian Velasquez. They're trying to find JJ. Well, JJ gets word of this, that they're trying to find him. And he calls. He's like, hey, he gets himself an attorney, and he wants to go down there and talk, figure out what's going on. So they go down to the police station. Long story short, they go down there. He goes on his own. He's like, hey, I'm here to talk about what's going on here. I had nothing to do with this. Well, his attorney said that the police wanted to put him in a photo lineup. And but his attorney suggested against that. He came out. He said, hey, let's go. I'm not going to let them do a lineup. JJ said, well, no. Whose decision is that? And his attorney said, it's your decision, but I would highly, advise against it. So JJ went in there, and he said, no, I've got nothing to hide. Let's get this over with. So they hand him a number, which I believe was number 2, and he goes in the lineup. And the accomplice, Derry Daniels, the guy who had the duct tape, and several other witnesses, obviously including Augustus Brown, picked JJ and said, hey, this is the guy. Now, let's keep in mind that JJ is not a light-skinned black male. JJ is Puerto Rican. He's not black, and he doesn't have dreads. He doesn't have jet black hair. So, but this is who they pick. Keep in mind they had no physical evidence linking JJ to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no blood, no sweat, nothing. They had nothing. But witnesses that were there said, hey, this is the guy. And so JJ was convicted. He was convicted, went to trial, solely convicted on witness identification alone. And there were so many problems with this case. And I'll dive into just a couple of them here in a minute. But so he was convicted and he went to prison. They sent him to Sing Sing State Penitentiary there in New York. And so in 2002, and this is where you got to listen to podcasts. The podcast is phenomenal. There's a lot of good podcasts out there, but this is one of the best that I've heard. Is such a good story. But in 2002, Dan Slepian with NBC Dateline receives a letter from JJ while he's sitting in Sing Sing, and he puts it out there. He says, listen, I'm innocent. I'm sitting in this prison, and they even talk about it in the podcast, and I've heard it too as a law enforcement professional. Everybody claims their innocence when they go to prison. No, because nobody wants to go to prison. Very few people actually own up to what they do. But JJ says, listen, Dan, I am innocent. And so Dan goes down to Sing Sing Penitentiary, and he visits with JJ. And JJ challenges Dan. He says, listen, you look into my case, and I challenge you. Prove me guilty. You look into everything you can look in. We will make sure you get all the documents, but prove me guilty. And so Dan took that challenge. He began to start looking into JJ's case in 2002. And so from 2002, so many things were uncovered. And it was, I can't recap it all, but a lot of the things that's a few of the things that stand out to me were during the investigation, or during the trial phase, there was a private investigator that was assigned to JJ who didn't do anything. Sometimes private investigators, from what I understand, get assigned to these cases, and they're to go try to track people down and kind of just do a reinvestigation. The private investigator didn't do anything. Dan Slepian even interviews this private investigator, and private investigators, listen, they didn't give me a lot of information. The attorneys didn't give me a lot of information. I was just kind of running around trying to knock on doors, talk to who I could talk to. So he didn't do a lot of investigating at all, really hardly anything. And Dan even says that in the podcast. He's like, hey, I've got to do the job of the private investigator, and the police job, because what investigation do the police do? So one of the things another thing that stood out to me is these eyewitnesses, going back to Augustus Brown. Augustus Brown sits down with Dan Slepian and says, look, I was in there for hours. I looked at, over 1,800 photos, and all these years I've wondered if I've picked the right person. So he that's a problem. I don't know if I picked the right person or not. Well, here he is sitting in prison. There was another eyewitness, and I can't remember her name. It was a female. She's on the podcast. But what's crazy about that is when they were on the stand, they asked that female to pick out the shooter, which was allegedly JJ. And the female points at the juror and says, that's who it is. All these eyewitnesses either recanted or there was a problem with their story, because there were several of them. But that's all they had, and they convicted him on that alone. So then Dan ends up talking to some of the jurors that was on the case, that sat in the courtroom. And even the jurors, they were sequestered for 3 days. They sent them off somewhere and said, hey, you guys can't leave and you can't go home until you reach a decision. And so there was a lot of inner turmoil during that process after Dan talked to these jurors. They wanted to go home. It was coming up on the weekend, and everybody's like, we're going to be here on Saturday, so we got to make a decision. And these jurors, they all just said, okay. They went with what they had, and they said, okay, this is what they're saying. 4 or 5 people saw him, so this must be it. And they convicted this man. And one of the jurors, bless her heart, she was on the podcast, and she was crying, and she's like, all these years, I've ruined somebody's life. She was remorseful. But somebody's sitting in prison all these years. And so going back to the name I mentioned earlier, Mustafa came back up. They ended up so Dan ended up doing a Dateline episode back in 2020, I believe. And when that Dateline episode aired, 2 people from Seattle, 2 witnesses, came forward and said, hey, we heard the name Mustafa on this episode, and we know a guy named Mustafa. Mustafa's been bragging about this murder, and he described everything. And this is what he said. Those 2 witnesses knew where Mustafa was, and they were going to be able to help JJ's case because they were at the time they were reinvestigating JJ's case. The Criminal Integrity Unit with the Manhattan DA's office was reinvestigating the case, and they said, "Hey, we know where Mustafa is. We have 2 witnesses. Can you help us?" And they shut them down. They said, "There's nothing we can do about you. Nothing we can do for you." They were able to meet Mustafa, wear a wire, all these things, and the DA's office just didn't care anything about it. And Mustafa's the one that they had as an actual suspect prior to JJ. And none of this stuff made it to trial. None of this stuff made it to trial. There were so many other things, and I don't really have time for it tonight. Again, I'm going to encourage you, Letters to Sing Sing. Go download that podcast and listen to it. But so what I find amazing and just completely miraculous is that you have a guy with NBC Dateline who obviously has a heart. Dan Slepian, he has a heart for people. For looking into wrongful convictions and giving people a chance. And not only is this an amazing story because eventually JJ ends up getting clemency from the Governor Cuomo in New York. And this was just days before he actually leaves office due to a scandal. But after all his appeals were denied, the conviction integrity unit said, "Hey, you know, he's guilty. We don't have enough evidence." All these things, one thing right after another, one thing right after another. He ends up receiving clemency from the governor in 2021 after 23 and a half years. Missed both of his boys growing up. All his family events, all the birthdays. He sat there in this prison in New York because somebody wanted a conviction, because somebody wanted a statistic for a grant to help for re-election, whatever the case may be. He sit there. And not only is it an amazing story because he does get out, now, his name's still not free. He's still not exonerated. He is still working on that, and I fully believe that's going to come down. But what makes the story even more amazing is Dan Slepian with NBC Dateline. And I knew the moment I met him, and when the guy didn't know me, and he just reached his arms out and he just pulled me and gave me a big hug and said, "Man," he's like, "Thank you for being here." He said, "Thank you for not only being here, but thank you for what you do. Thank you for your service. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you for the stand that you were taking." And so I knew immediately, I was like, this is a good man. When you just meet somebody and you know this is a good person. And that was my vibe from him. And what I find amazing is that for 20 plus years, he documents his investigation of JJ. It is an amazing story to hear because for 20 years he works on this case tirelessly, time and time again. And he told JJ, he says, "I can't promise you anything, but I can promise that if you are innocent, I will work for you and I will go to bat for you." And he did. And they ended up they're like family now. It's amazing to hear them tell their story on this podcast, and just to see how they grew close. And Dan says it too. He says, he's like, "I'm not an advocate for JJ. I'm an advocate for justice and for truth." And just how they became so close, like family. JJ's sons. Well, matter of fact, when I met John Jr., JJ's son, when he pointed to Dan, he said, "That's my uncle over there," And man, they're just such a close, tight knit family. And one thing I saw out of the corner of my eye, I was talking to somebody, and just out of my peripheral eye, I looked over, and I saw JJ. He was he reached his arms around John Jr. John Jr. was sitting down, and JJ puts his arm around him from the back, and he just gave him the hug. And I looked over there, and I was like, man, it was just such an amazing moment to see that, because he lost so many years with his son. And his son went through some hard times. His son ended up getting in trouble. His son was fighting the system. But because, and this is one thing that we don't think about, one thing that I am starting to learn now, really more than ever before, because it's nothing that's taught, nothing that you think of as a law enforcement officer. But one thing that I'm learning is that, and I'm so glad I've come to light, I've seen the light with this, is that when parents are incarcerated, kids are affected. The kids have to navigate this world without a father or without a mother, and there's nothing but trouble out here. And if you don't have your parent, your father or mother there to help guide you through this world, and you're left out on your own to do your own thing, and you get caught up in the wrong crowd, and it's just a repetitive cycle. And so one of the things that I've come to see and understand is that that is important. That is real important, that if we're locking people up, we are making sure that it is done for the right reasons, and so that's why I'm all about this criminal justice reform, because I saw the effect. And you listen to the podcast, it'll pull at your heartstrings, because JJ's absence most certainly led to John Jr.'s encounter with the criminal justice system, and that relationship that they have now, that John Jr. and JJ have, is just amazing to see. And I saw it for myself, and but and then it's even 10 times worse if you're locking somebody up that is, that didn't do the crime. You're locking somebody up who didn't do the crime, and you're taking them away from their family, just like JJ. It's bad enough if somebody did do the crime and they have to go to prison and the kids have to experience it, but it's 10 times worse if you're locking somebody up who didn't do the crime, who's been wrongfully convicted. And it seemed to me, just kind of by listening to this case, was that, it was a retired NYPD cop. This shooting happened, this murder happened in the precinct that the cop worked for or worked in. And so, of course, you talk, cop killer, they want to find somebody, and they'll go to any length to find somebody. Now, I know that's the extreme, right? Because that's a retired cop, murder, but that goes with any case in law enforcement. Like, we, as law enforcement, now specifically detectives, because I was a major crimes detective. I investigated homicides, murders, capital murders, major felony assaults, all these things. And so it's like, you have to, when you're investigating these cases, you have to take a look and say, slow down, number one, and then look at all of the evidence that you have, or all the evidence that you don't have. No matter how bad you want to get a conviction, no matter how bad you want to make an arrest, no matter how bad you want to make an indictment, you have to think clearly. And I'm guilty of it. Like, when I think back of all the cases that I investigated, I'm like, okay, you're getting pressure from the top. It's a major case, major murder. The public's like, do something. Why haven't they got this guy yet? And then you have, your boss is saying, why haven't you done anything? What are you doing? And that right there will lead to disaster, to error. These are people's lives. These are real people, just like you and I, with families. And I've said it time and time again on these wrongful convictions. We've had a couple guys in here who've been wrongfully convicted. And I always say this, having somebody sit across from me, and I've met a lot of exonerees just in the last couple months, and seeing these people, seeing their families, hearing them talk, listening to their heart, these are real people. And I'll say it 1,000 times over. It's not they're not just a headline. They're not just, you're not just scrolling down Facebook and you see, oh, man convicted, or wrongfully convicted, exonerated after 20 years, 30 years, whatever. And you just say, oh, that sucks. And you keep scrolling. Like, these people are real. And never, ever, as a law enforcement officer, have I realized that. It was just like farming out cases. Get this case done, move to the next. Get this case done, move to the next. And not slowing down and thinking about the people, the cases that you're working, and for justice. So many times as law enforcement, we look at detectives and we say, what makes a good detective? For the longest time, what I thought made a good detective was arrests. How many warrants you got signed, whether it be search warrants or arrest warrants. How many people did you put in jail on your cases? How many indictments did you get? How many convictions did you get? And I feel like the system is just so full of statistics. Like, all we want is statistics. And what we don't understand, or what I feel like we fail to understand, is that these statistics, these numbers are real people with lives and families just like us. And one of the things that I listened to on the panel discussion was the one that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the panel discussion at the summit called Family Matters, where these family members were sitting up there. And one of the things that they mentioned that was real striking to me was, these police officers, these judges, these district attorneys, they get to go home to their families. They get to have their Christmases. They get to have their birthdays. They get to have their 4th of Julys, these special events, with their families. And a lot of times they don't think twice about who they just locked up. And that struck me because I was like, they're right. Like, how many people have I locked up? And I don't think anything else of it. Now, again, Fat Joe the rapper, he was at the UJC conference, and one of the things that he said that stood out to me was like, we're all gathering here in the name of justice, and wrongful convictions and injustices and misdeeds by the police. He's like, we all can't be innocent. He's like, all of our family members aren't innocent. But for the ones that are, and so I say that because obviously there are people that deserve to go to prison. There is a place for incarceration. There's a place for the system. I completely agree with that. But for the ones, that have been locked up, that are locked, the numbers are staggering. As I've started digging into this and seeing what the numbers actually are, the numbers of the people that are locked up right now in our prison systems that are innocent, they're staggering. And it's sad to me because I feel like it bothers me, and I can't take all the burden. But it bothers me that so many people are locked up that were innocent victims of a system that I was a part of or am a part of. And for so many years, I did not see those injustices. And so that's why right now, I am taking a stand and I'm saying, look, I'm going to do different. I'm going to expose the injustices. We're going to talk about them. We're going to have the hard conversations. And we've talked about it time and time again with the different guests that I've had on the show. Police, the police, law enforcement, the prosecution side, those in the criminal legal system do not want to admit when they are wrong. They don't want to admit it. And sometimes I think they're just so closed-minded that they can't even see where they're wrong. It's a different story if you know you're wrong and you don't admit it. Like, that's a whole other topic. But then the other part is you're so closed-minded that you cannot see, hey, I'm wrong here. You can't even have an open heart or an open mind to look at something. And that's what I find really disturbing about JJ's case is that there were so many things that came up along the way during Dan Slepian's investigation. There's so many things that come up that were, just to me, as a law enforcement officer, a person who's been a major crimes detective, who's investigated homicides and from kids all the way to adults and just shootings and carnage, who's investigated these cases. When I heard some of these things on that podcast, I was like, you got to be freaking kidding me. And then when it gets presented to the district attorney's office, to the criminal integrity unit, and they look at it and they just shun it off as if, oh, no, because they want justice for the cop killer. And while I understand that, clearly, if somebody killed one of my buddies that's a cop or killed me, I would expect people to go out and get justice. But you can't just lock somebody up. You can't just bring in a body and say, okay, we got somebody. Just because even you have a hunch. There are some things, I've said this all along. When you're doing an investigation as a law enforcement officer, you have to, not only should you try to, implicate somebody, you should also try to prove their innocence. Because to me, this was said once before, if somebody is guilty, it's really hard to prove them innocent. And so many times as law enforcement officers and detectives, what makes a good detective is somebody who can get a stat, who can get a conviction, who can, get an indictment. And that's what law enforcement looks at detectives, good detectives, as like, hey, this guy can do that, or this girl can do that. And while I think those things are good, clearly, because you got to have people who are smart, who can outthink the bad guys, and who can do good investigations. But the problem is when you just put your sole focus on that alone, and that detective's like, I'm a hot shot. I've got this many convictions. I've got this many indictments. I've had this many arrests, and everybody around me is looking and they're saying, I have a reputation to keep up with, or, this was a cop killer, or this was a baby killer, and I have got to make this happen. And that is when the mistakes are made, is because you don't slow down and you have that tunnel vision and you're like, this is the person, and you don't see the many, many things that happen around you that could, and obviously I'm not talking, every case is not a wrongful conviction case, and I think we've done better. We've talked about this. I think we've done better procedurally, especially at the witness identifications. You don't just bring people in anymore and just start looking at photos. That there's a process and procedure for that now that's way better. But it could still happen in modern day. It can certainly still happen, and it still happens. And so I'm so thankful that I was able to go and to New York City and be a part of this summit. What an amazing day that it was! It was such an eye opener. I wish it would have lasted longer, and I'm already looking forward to going next year. Met some really cool people there. That I'm gonna try to get on this podcast. I'm gonna try to get JJ on this podcast eventually when his schedule frees up. I'm in contact with Dan Slepian. We're supposed to be in contact after the first of the year. Don't know where that's going to lead, but I promise you one thing, as it says right here on my screen, it's unmasking truth, healing justice, and transforming the system. That is that's what Failing Justice is about. That's what this organization is about. It's not just a podcast. I mean, a podcast is important because here I am talking about these injustices from a law enforcement perspective on the criminal justice side, where these law enforcement they're not really having these conversations. And so, yeah, the podcast is important, but it's just more than that. It's about going out here and meeting these people and saying, listen, I'm from the other side, but I hear you. I hear what you're saying. I hear what you've gone through. I see the tragedy that your family's gone through. What can we do? What can I do on the law enforcement side to change that for somebody else, that way somebody else doesn't go through that? That's what this is about. It's about being there for the other side and bridging that gap, because there's such a divide between law enforcement and those in the criminal justice system and the community. There's that divide, and it's right. It's a right divide, rightfully so. There's been so many things that's happened that there is no trust. It's completely eroded, and we have to fix that. That's That happens through conversations. That happens through legislation. That happens through sitting down and just hearing these people out and letting them know, look, I hear your heart. I hear your mind. And we're going to do everything that we can do to make sure that this doesn't happen to somebody else. And let's work together. And I think if, I call it the us versus them mentality. I use that a lot because that's just the truth. It should not be us versus them. Law enforcement is also here to, we're not just here to put the bad guy away. There's so many things that we are here to do, and it should all be in the name of justice and doing what's right at the right time for the right reasons, because there are people out there that need us. Judges, district attorneys, everybody listening to this show, if you are in public service in the criminal justice system, these people need us. They need us to be fair. They need us to be unbiased. They need us to slow down. They need us to hear them out. And so I was thankful to be there this last week, to be a part of that, and to just see the other side and realize that, there's so much more that we can do in this criminal justice system to be better, and at least try. I'm not going to save the world. I may not even be able to make a huge impact, but I know I can make an impact, and that's what I'm here for. So, guys, listen, look up that podcast again. It's called Letters to Sing Sing. I want to show you this picture one more time. There you see JJ, Jon-Adrian Velasquez on the right. That's the man that did 23 and a half years in Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York for a murder that he did not commit. And that's the man on the left, Dan Slepian, who spent 20 years investigating JJ's case and advocating for justice, because if it wasn't for him, JJ wouldn't have gotten out. Nobody wanted to hear him. Nobody wanted to hear his case. Everything that they presented, they just shut it down. And so, look that up. Letters to Sing Sing, or Letters from Sing Sing. 8 episodes. They're about anywhere 35 to 45 minutes each. So might take a couple days to listen to it, but I promise you it's worth the time. But listen, that's it for the podcast tonight. I appreciate everybody tuning in and listening. It's December. December's busy. We're only going to have one more podcast this month before Christmas. I'm gonna spend time with my family. Believe it or not, I have a full-time career, and this takes up so much of my time and so much of my energy. It's important. It's extremely important. But I'm going to take the last 2 weeks of December off, and we'll hit 2024 strong. There's big things coming, I feel like, for Failing Justice. So, but that's it for tonight. Thank you guys for tuning in. Remember, share this. Tell your friends about Failing Justice. We are on the web at failingjustice.org. You can also find us on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X. I never know what to call that anymore. We're just going to call it Twitter. Find us on Twitter. The handle is @failing1 justice. Again, the @failing1 justice, and that's on all social media platforms. You can also find the podcast on all major podcast platforms, wherever you get your podcasts from. Failingjustice.org. Spread the word. Like this, share it. Tell your friends. Go to the failingjustice.org. Send us a donation. We are working on nonprofit status right now, so that's going to kick off in 24. But we have to have you spread this message because it's so crucial and important. But I thank each and every one of you for tuning in, for listening, for your support, and God bless you guys. And we will see you next podcast.
This is Failing Justice.